73,000 people filling every seat, and millions more watching from living rooms across America. The Gulf War had begun just 10 days earlier, and the nation was holding its breath, caught between patriotic fervor and genuine fear. This Super Bowl wasn't just a football game. It was a moment when America needed to believe in something bigger than the chaos unfolding overseas. And standing in a cramped dressing room beneath the stadium, her hands shaking as she pressed ice packs against her throat, Whitney Houston was about to either deliver the performance that would define her legacy or destroy her voice forever. 2 hours earlier, her vocal coach had found her unable to produce a single clear note. The doctors had been explicit in their warning. If she attempted to sing the national anthem with her vocal cords in their current inflamed state, she risked permanent damage that could end her career. But 73,000 people were waiting. The entire nation was watching. And Whitney Houston had never walked away from a promise in her life. What happened in the next 109 seconds would become the most legendary national anthem performance in American history. But the price Whitney paid for that moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. If you lived through 1991, you remember exactly where you were when Operation Desert Storm began. The tension was everywhere, in grocery stores and gas stations, in churches and living rooms. American troops were fighting in Iraq, and the entire country existed in this strange state of anxious patriotism, wanting to support the soldiers while terrified of what might come next. The Super Bowl that year carried weight beyond football. It was America's chance to gather together, to feel unified, to remind itself of who it was and what it stood for. The producers knew they needed something special for the national anthem, something that would capture the moment's gravity while lifting spirits. They needed a voice that could make 73,000 people feel connected to something larger than themselves. They needed Whitney Houston. But what they didn't know, what almost nobody knew until years later, was that Whitney had been fighting a brutal upper respiratory infection for nearly 2 weeks. She'd been on tour when the Super Bowl invitation came, performing night after night in cities across America, and somewhere between Detroit and Chicago, she'd caught something that settled deep in her chest and throat. By the time she arrived in Tampa 3 days before the game, her voice was already compromised. Gary Katona, Whitney's vocal coach, noticed immediately during their first rehearsal. The effortless power that usually characterized Whitney's voice was strained. The high notes that she typically hit with crystalline precision were scratchy and inconsistent. The breath control that allowed her to hold notes for impossible lengths was labored and uncertain. This wasn't just fatigue from touring. This was serious. Gary pulled Whitney aside after that first rehearsal, his face etched with concern that he tried to hide from the sound engineers and producers who were watching every moment. He'd worked with Whitney since her earliest days, had guided her through countless performances, and he'd never heard her voice sound quite like this. The inflammation was deep, affecting not just her throat, but the delicate mechanisms that produced her remarkable range. They needed to address this immediately, but Whitney was already shaking her head before he finished speaking. She knew what he was going to suggest: complete vocal rest, cancellation, letting someone else perform the anthem. But canceling wasn't an option Whitney could consider. She understood what this moment meant, not just for her career, but for the country. American soldiers were listening to this game on armed forces radio in the middle of a war zone. Families with sons and daughters overseas were gathering around television sets, desperate for any moment of normalcy and connection. The producers had chosen her specifically because they believed her voice could unite people during a fractured, frightening time. How could she walk away from that responsibility because her throat hurt? The day before the Super Bowl, Whitney's condition worsened dramatically. She woke up in her hotel room barely able to speak above a whisper, her throat so swollen and painful that swallowing water brought tears to her eyes. Her assistant immediately called for a doctor, and within an hour, Dr. Richard Morrison, one of Tampa's leading ear, nose, and throat specialists, was examining Whitney in her hotel suite. What he found alarmed him deeply. Whitney's vocal cords were severely inflamed, showing signs of both infection and strain. The delicate tissues that vibrated to create her legendary voice were red, swollen, and in Dr. Morrison's professional opinion, in no condition to attempt anything as vocally demanding as the national anthem, especially not with the added pressure of performing before 73,000 people and a television audience in the millions. The doctor's recommendation was unequivocal and non-negotiable. Complete vocal rest for at least 2 weeks, meaning no speaking, no singing, no sound production whatsoever. Any attempt to sing with her vocal cords in this condition risked not just a poor performance but permanent damage that could alter her voice forever or potentially end her singing career entirely. The scar tissue that could form from pushing inflamed vocal cords too hard might leave her unable to hit the high notes that had made her famous, might rob her of the control and power that defined her as an artist. Whitney listened to Dr. Morrison's diagnosis and recommendation in silence, her face revealing nothing of the turmoil she felt inside. When he finished, she asked him one simple question. If she did perform tomorrow, what would happen? The doctor's response was careful but honest. In the best-case scenario, she might get through the performance with only temporary additional damage, requiring months of recovery and vocal therapy. In the worst case, she could experience a vocal hemorrhage mid-performance, causing her voice to give out completely in front of the nation, followed by permanent scarring that would fundamentally change her instrument forever. The risk wasn't just professional embarrassment. It was career-ending injury. But Dr. Morrison also understood the impossible position Whitney was in, and after a long moment of consideration, he offered a compromise of sorts. If Whitney absolutely insisted on performing, he could provide steroid injections and anti-inflammatory medications that might reduce the swelling enough to make singing possible. However, he emphasized repeatedly that this would only mask the problem, not fix it. The underlying damage would still be there, and pushing through it could make everything worse. The medications might allow her to perform, but they wouldn't protect her from the consequences. To understand the weight of the decision Whitney faced, you need to understand where she came from and what music meant to her family. Whitney Houston wasn't just another talented singer who'd become famous. She was musical royalty, born into a legacy that stretched back through gospel traditions and soul music history. Her mother, Whitney Houston, was a legendary gospel singer who'd performed with Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley. Her cousin was Dionne Warwick, and her godmother was Aretha Franklin herself. In the Houston family, singing wasn't just a career or a talent. It was a calling, a responsibility, a way of connecting to something divine. From her earliest childhood, Whitney had been taught that when you had a gift like hers, you didn't use it for yourself alone. You used it to lift others, to bring comfort, to create moments of transcendence that helped people feel less alone. Her mother's lessons had been clear and unwavering. When people needed your voice, you gave it to them, regardless of personal cost. That philosophy had driven Whitney through countless performances when she was tired, sick, or emotionally drained. It had pushed her to excellence when settling for good enough would have been easier. And now, it was pushing her toward a decision that terrified her even as she knew she would make it. The evening before the Super Bowl, Whitney called her mother. Whitney Houston had been following her daughter's condition with growing concern, and when she heard Whitney's raspy whisper on the phone, her worry intensified. For nearly an hour, mother and daughter talked about the impossible choice ahead. Sissy knew her daughter's voice better than anyone, had trained it from childhood, had nurtured every note and taught her how to protect and preserve her instrument. She also knew the pressure Whitney was under and the sense of obligation that drove her. What Sissy told Whitney that night would stay with Whitney for the rest of her life. She didn't tell her daughter to cancel or to push through. Instead, she shared a story from her own career, a moment when she'd had to decide between her voice and her values. Years earlier, Sissy had been scheduled to sing at a benefit concert for families of fallen soldiers, but she'd been recovering from bronchitis, and her doctor had advised against performing. She'd sung anyway, and yes, it had taken months for her voice to fully recover. But decades later, she still remembered the faces of the mothers and widows in that audience, the way her music had given them a brief respite from grief. She'd made the right choice, and she'd do it again. January 27th, 1991. Game day. Whitney woke at dawn with her throat still screaming in protest, the inflammation no better despite the medications Dr. Morrison had prescribed. She went through her morning routine in silence, saving every bit of vocal strength for what lay ahead. At noon, she met with the Super Bowl producers, Gary Katona, and her management team for what everyone knew was a crucial decision point. The producers had arranged for a backup singer to be on standby, someone who could step in if Whitney couldn't perform. They'd kept this information quiet, not wanting to alarm the public or create a story that might overshadow the game itself, but they needed Whitney's final decision now. The alternative performer was talented and capable, someone who could deliver a solid, if not transcendent, rendition of the national anthem. Choosing her would be the safe, responsible decision. Whitney looked at the faces around her, seeing concern, anxiety, and unspoken pressure. She knew what they wanted her to say, knew that the logical, sensible choice was to step aside and protect her voice for the long term. But she also knew, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't make that choice. She thought about the American soldiers listening in the desert, about the families gathered around televisions hopping for a moment of pride and unity, about the weight this Super Bowl carried in a frightened nation. She thought about her mother's story and the lessons she'd learned about using your gifts when they were needed most. And she thought about something else too, something she didn't share with anyone in that room. She thought about how rare it was to have a moment where your voice could actually matter, where what you did could make a difference beyond entertainment or commerce. The decision, when she made it, was calm and clear. She would perform. Dr. Morrison would administer the steroid injections and give her the strongest anti-inflammatory medications available. She would do extensive vocal warm-ups, carefully managed by Gary to minimize additional strain. And then she would walk out onto that field and sing the national anthem the way she'd been taught, with everything she had, and let the consequences be what they would be. The relief in the room was palpable, but so was the anxiety. Everyone there understood that they were watching Whitney risk everything on a single performance. If her voice gave out mid-anthem, if she couldn't hit the high notes, or if the strain became visible to the audience, it wouldn't just be an embarrassing moment. It would be a national disappointment, a failure at the exact moment when failure was most public and most costly. The Tampa Stadium dressing room, where Whitney prepared for her performance, was small, concrete-walled, and incredibly far from the glamorous image most people had of Super Bowl performances. It smelled of old sweat and industrial cleaning products, and the fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh, unflattering tones. But for the next 2 hours, this cramped, ugly room would be where Whitney Houston prepared to deliver the most important performance of her career. Dr. Morrison arrived first, carrying his medical bag and wearing an expression that made clear he still thought this was a terrible idea. The steroid injections he needed to administer were painful, targeting areas around Whitney's vocal cords to reduce inflammation quickly. Each needle stick made Whitney wince, but she remained still and silent, focused entirely on what was coming. The medications would take about 90 minutes to reach full effectiveness, meaning the timing had to be absolutely precise. Too early, and they'd wear off before she finished. Too late, and they wouldn't work at all. While they waited for the medications to take effect, Gary Katona worked with Whitney on careful, controlled vocal exercises. Not the full-throated warm-ups she usually did, but gentle, precise techniques designed to assess her current vocal capacity without causing additional damage. After 20 minutes, the results were both encouraging and terrifying. The inflammation had reduced slightly, and Whitney could now produce sound across her full range, but everything was fragile, tenuous, requiring twice the effort it normally did. The power and effortlessness that usually characterized her voice were absent, replaced by a sense of her vocal cords working at the absolute edge of their capability. Gary had worked with enough professional singers to know what this meant. Whitney could technically perform the anthem, but she'd be operating without any safety margin whatsoever. Every note would require perfect technique, perfect breath control, perfect everything. One small mistake, one moment of lost control, and her voice could fail completely. As game time approached and the stadium above them filled with excited fans, Whitney sat alone in a corner of the dressing room, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her throat. Those who were there later described the moment as both peaceful and intensely focused, as if Whitney was gathering every bit of strength and will she possessed and directing it toward the single task ahead. The walk from the dressing room to the field felt endless. Whitney moved through concrete corridors lined with stadium staff and officials, all of them stopping to watch as she passed. She was wearing a white tracksuit with red and blue accents, designed to evoke the American flag without being costumey. Her hair was pulled back simply, and she wore minimal makeup. Everything about her appearance was meant to communicate strength, confidence, and patriotic simplicity. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior, Whitney's heart was racing, and her throat felt like it was coated in broken glass. The anti-inflammatory medications had helped, but every swallow reminded her of how precarious her situation was. As she emerged onto the field, the roar of 73,000 people hit her like a physical force. The crowd was enormous, filling every seat in the stadium, their faces a blur of American flags and team colors. The January sun was bright, the Florida air warm, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. This wasn't just any sporting event. This was America trying to feel strong and united while its soldiers fought overseas. The national anthem wasn't going to be background music. It was going to be a moment of collective emotion, a chance for everyone present and everyone watching at home to express their fear, their hope, and their love of country through song. Whitney walked to the microphone stand positioned at the 50-yard line, and as she did, she noticed something that nearly broke her composure. Military personnel lined the field, holding an enormous American flag that stretched across the grass. Some of these men and women would be deployed to the Gulf within days. They were watching her with expressions that revealed how much this moment meant to them, how desperately they needed to hear something that would remind them why they were willing to put their lives at risk. The pressure of that responsibility hit Whitney harder than any physical pain. These people needed her to be strong, needed her voice to carry their emotions and give them something to hold on to. She couldn't let them down, no matter what it cost her. The stadium announcer's voice boomed across the crowd, introducing Whitney Houston to perform the national anthem. The applause was thunderous, respectful, filled with expectation. And then, as 73,000 people fell silent and millions more watched on television, Whitney Houston stepped up to the microphone and prayed that her damaged, inflamed, medicated vocal cords would hold for just 109 more seconds. The opening note of the national anthem is deceptively simple, starting in a comfortable middle range before the melody begins its challenging climb. Whitney had sung this song hundreds of times in her life, knew every phrase and interval instinctively. But this time, as she opened her mouth to sing, "Oh, say can you see," she felt the fragility of her voice immediately. The note came out, clear and strong enough. She could feel the effort it required, the way her vocal cords protested even that simple phrase. The first verse continued, and Whitney found herself hyper-aware of every technical element. Her breath control, which usually came naturally, required conscious focus. The placement of each note, which she typically managed through instinct, now demanded deliberate attention. It was like walking a tightrope where normally she would have strolled across solid ground. But something miraculous was happening too. The medications, the warm-ups, and most importantly, Whitney's absolute determination were combining to produce something extraordinary. Yes, her throat hurt with every note. Yes, she could feel the strain and knew she was damaging her voice further with each phrase. But the sound coming out was pure, powerful, and filled with emotion that transcended technical concerns. As the anthem progressed toward its most challenging section, the high note on "Free," that would test the upper limits of Whitney's range, everyone who knew about her condition held their breath. This was the moment where vocal failure was most likely, where inflamed vocal cords might simply refuse to produce the required sound. Gary Katona, watching from the sidelines, later said his heart was pounding so hard he thought he might pass out. Dr. Morrison, also present, was mentally calculating what emergency interventions might be needed if Whitney's voice gave out mid-performance. And Whitney herself, standing at that microphone with 73,000 people watching and millions more at home, knew she was about to attempt something that could either crown her career or destroy it. She took a breath, deeper than she'd ever taken before, and let it out as the soaring high note on "Free" that every American knows, that makes crowds cheer and brings tears to eyes. The note came out perfect, crystalline and powerful, held for exactly the right length, and released with absolute control. The stadium erupted in applause mid-performance, something that almost never happens during the national anthem, but the people couldn't help themselves. What they just witnessed was beyond impressive. It was transcendent. Whitney continued through the final phrases, her voice never wavering, never showing even a hint of the crisis happening in her throat. The closing line, "O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave," built to its traditional climactic finish, and as the last note faded, the stadium exploded into the loudest, longest ovation anyone could remember at a sporting event. 73,000 people were on their feet, cheering, crying, united in a moment of pure emotional release. Fighter jets screamed overhead in a planned flyover, their timing so perfect it seemed choreographed to Whitney's final note. American flags waved everywhere, and the cameras captured faces throughout the crowd openly weeping, overcome by the combination of Whitney's performance, the moment's patriotic weight, and the release of all the tension and fear the nation had been carrying since the war began. Whitney stood at that microphone for a moment, acknowledging the applause, her face showing a mix of relief, exhaustion, and something else. A kind of pain that went beyond physical discomfort. She'd done it. She delivered what many would call the greatest national anthem performance in American history. But she'd also done exactly what Dr. Morrison had warned against, and she could feel the consequences already beginning in her damaged throat. Whitney left the field quickly, her smile in place for the cameras, but her hand immediately going to her throat as soon as she was out of public view. In the dressing room, Dr. Morrison was waiting, and the examination he conducted confirmed what Whitney already knew. The performance had caused significant additional damage to her vocal cords. The inflammation had worsened, and there were signs of minor hemorrhaging in the delicate tissues. The good news was that nothing was permanently broken, nothing that couldn't heal with proper rest and treatment. The bad news was that healing was going to take months, not weeks. Whitney would need to cancel upcoming performances, postpone recording sessions, and undergo intensive vocal therapy. The voice that had just delivered a perfect national anthem was going to need complete silence for the foreseeable future. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that room. Whitney had sacrificed her voice to sing the national anthem, and now that voice needed to be protected through enforced silence. The public knew none of this, of course. All they saw was the transcendent performance, the perfect notes, the emotional power. Whitney's rendition of the national anthem became the anthem performance against which all others would be measured. It was released as a single, with all proceeds going to military charities, and it shot to number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, a virtually unprecedented achievement for a national anthem recording. The video of the performance was played thousands of times, became required viewing in music schools, and remained a staple of patriotic celebrations for decades. But every time Whitney watched that video in the years that followed, she saw something different than what the public saw. She saw the moment she'd chosen temporary glory over long-term health, the instant she decided that one perfect performance was worth months of pain and recovery. She never regretted the choice, not exactly, but she understood the cost in a way no one else could. The damage to her vocal cords from that Super Bowl performance healed slowly and incompletely. Whitney returned to performing within a few months, and to the public, everything seemed fine, but those closest to her noticed subtle changes. Certain notes became slightly more difficult. The effortless power that had once seemed infinite now required more conscious management. The invincibility she'd once felt in her voice was replaced by a new awareness of its fragility. Gary Katona later reflected that the Super Bowl performance marked a turning point in Whitney's relationship with her voice. Before that day, she'd sung with the confidence of someone who believed her instrument was unbreakable. After that day, there was always a whisper of doubt, a tiny fear that her voice might fail her when she needed it most. Some vocal coaches and music historians believe that the long-term effects of that Super Bowl performance contributed to the vocal struggles Whitney experienced later in her career. The scar tissue that formed as her vocal cords healed, combined with other factors and stresses, may have made her voice more vulnerable to the damage that would eventually become so visible in her later years. It's impossible to prove this connection definitively, but the timeline and the symptoms align in troubling ways. What is certain is that the Super Bowl performance represented a choice Whitney made consciously and with full knowledge of the risks. She chose to give the nation what it needed in a moment of fear and uncertainty, even though it meant sacrificing something precious and irreplaceable. She chose others over herself, the collective need over personal preservation. In the years following that January afternoon in Tampa, Whitney spoke occasionally about the Super Bowl performance, always with pride, but also with a kind of wistful understanding. In a 2009 interview, just 3 years before her death, she talked about that day with unusual candor. The interviewer had asked about the performance, expecting a typical story of triumph and glory. Instead, Whitney's response was reflective and honest. She explained about the vocal problems, the doctor's warnings, and the choice she'd made to perform anyway. "I knew I was hurting myself," she said, her voice still carrying echoes of the power it once possessed. "But I also knew that sometimes you have to give people what they need, even if it costs you something. Those soldiers needed to hear that anthem sung with everything I had. America needed a moment of strength and beauty, and I had the ability to give them that moment, so how could I not? The interviewer asked if she would make the same choice again, knowing what she knew now about the long-term consequences. Whitney's answer was immediate and certain. In a heartbeat, she said. That performance mattered. It helped people. It gave them something to hold on to during a scary time. That's what voices like mine are for, not just to make pretty sounds, but to connect people to something bigger than themselves. When Whitney Houston died in February 2012, just 3 weeks after what would have been the 21st anniversary of her Super Bowl performance, the footage of that anthem was played constantly in memorial coverage. Millions of people watched it again, many for the first time truly understanding what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a talented singer delivering a strong performance. This was an artist giving everything she had, literally sacrificing her instrument to create a moment of transcendence for others. The lesson of Whitney's Super Bowl performance extends far beyond music or entertainment. It's a lesson about choices, about what we're willing to sacrifice for moments that matter, about the difference between protecting what we have and using what we have to serve something larger than ourselves. Whitney Houston had every logical reason to cancel that performance. The medical advice was clear, the risks were real, and no one would have blamed her for choosing self-preservation. But she understood something profound, that sometimes the greatest achievements come from the choices we make when the easy path and the right path diverge. She chose the right path, knowing the cost, and in doing so, she gave America a gift that has echoed through decades. 109 seconds of perfect music, delivered at the exact moment it was needed most, by a woman who understood that some things are worth the price we pay for them. Today, more than 3 decades after that January afternoon, Whitney Houston's Super Bowl performance remains the gold standard against which all others are judged. Music students study the technical excellence, the breath control, the perfect pitch and timing. But they also study something else, the intangible quality that made that performance special beyond its technical merits. They study what it looks like when an artist gives absolutely everything, holding nothing back, risking everything for art. The recording of that performance has been downloaded millions of times, featured in countless documentaries and retrospectives, and introduced to new generations who weren't alive when it happened. Each time someone discovers it, they're discovering not just a great vocal performance, but a moment when music, patriotism, and human courage combined to create something that transcended the sum of its parts. For those who were there that day, in the stadium or watching at home, the memory remains vivid and powerful. They remember where they were sitting, who they were with, and how they felt as Whitney's voice soared across that field. They remember the fighter jets, the enormous flag, and the sense of national unity in a frightening time. And if they knew the full story of what Whitney risked and sacrificed to give them that moment, their appreciation would deepen even further. The true measure of that performance isn't found in the awards it won or the charts it climbed. It's found in the soldiers who listened to it in the desert and felt connected to home. It's found in the families who gathered around televisions and felt, for just a few minutes, that everything might be okay. It's found in the countless people who, in their own difficult moments over the following decades, listened to that recording and drew strength from Whitney's voice. 109 seconds of music, delivered by a woman with damaged vocal cords who chose to sing anyway. That's the story of Whitney Houston's Super Bowl performance, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the transformative power of giving everything you have when it matters most. If this story of Whitney Houston's incredible sacrifice moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to remember that greatness often requires sacrifice, and that the moments we give everything are often the moments that matter most. What would you sacrifice to give others something they desperately needed? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget, we have more untold stories that reveal the human heart behind music's greatest legends.